Yeah.
So we managed to lock you in.
Yeah, we were just talking outside, and it's a short window of time, but stars aligned.
The stars aligned for us, honestly. How's your day been so far?
Today's been good. I'm back home in Cairns. You don't get back here too often, so it's just nice to hang, spend some time with family, and I've been looking forward to this. I think it's going to be a good chat.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Do you want to start off by telling us why it's been so hard to lock you in? Where have you been?
Yeah, we kind of jump around a lot. We've just kind of made Hawaii home base. We live on the big island of Hawaii. We've kind of been stopping there for a couple of years between the east coast of the US and coming back here to Cairns. And it's right in the middle. It's beautiful. We kind of felt a little bit of a calling last time we were there, so we decided to put down roots there. So we'll be there for the next couple of years.
Love that. Just a little bit off the coast of Cairns.
Yeah, exactly. Just a quick 10-hour flight.
Yeah.
Basically next door neighbours at this point.
Yeah.
And you were saying before you've kind of travelled all over the place. Where else have you been?
I spent a couple of years kind of living and traveling in Europe. My dad's from the UK, from Scotland, so I kind of wanted to go see where he grew up, but just use that as a base to kind of travel around Europe. And then spent a fair bit of time in Mexico, South America, and then since I met my wife, a lot of time in the US.
Well travelled, very well travelled. Yeah, that's awesome.
I honestly, if I could make travel my vocation, I definitely would.
Has that affected like your learning and kind of what you do for a living?
I honestly do think it's probably one of my greatest teachers, and I think that's true of anyone, not just my teacher. I think you get the perspective that the way you do something is not the only way to do it, and I think until you broaden that perspective, like, wait, there's plenty of ways I can do this. That broadening of perspective is a very healthy thing.
Yeah. So kind of sprinted to it. Do you want to tell us what you do?
It's funny, I've always kind of thought of what the title is. Traditionally, my education, I'm a physiotherapist, but the last kind of 6, 7, maybe even 8 years now, I've really just been kind of immersed in the world of breathwork. So at this point, I would maybe call myself a breathwork educator, and we run a certification for other health practitioners to kind of help them understand and apply the science of breathing. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about it today, but I see breathwork on this spectrum. There's the kind of experiential side of breathwork, which is very much like the transformation, the catharsis, the emotional release. But the other side of that spectrum is kind of this restorative, corrective side of breathing. We see kind of pretty crazy statistics in terms of like how prevalent dysfunctional breathing is. So a lot of my time is kind of spending time teaching people how to assess and treat breathing, which sounds kind of funny, we're all breathing. But just because we do something all the time doesn't mean we do it well.
Yeah. So you're a physio by trade.
Physio by trade.
What initially drew you to breathwork as, I suppose, a niche under that physio banner?
Yeah, it was actually two things. I remember this one client. I was working in ICU at the time as a respiratory physiotherapist, and our job in that setting is to kind of come in and make sure people are breathing well, but make sure they're mobilizing as well. And I came in to give this guy a short walk, and just the kind of sheer effort to get out of the bed and get into a chair that was a couple of meters away. And then he just stopped and said, when you can't breathe, nothing else matters. And I'd never even considered that, right? I don't think many of us have, other than getting winded on the playground or something where you're just gasping for breath. But that really just like flipped a switch for me in terms of like, I'd spent 5 years at school as a physio, and we had one lecture on the diaphragm, and it was really on neurological injuries. Like if someone's in a car accident, they sever this nerve, what happens, and it wasn't on how the diaphragm influences our emotional state and our mindset, our energy, our posture, our movement, like all these really critical things. And so that kind of just set me off a path. And around about the same time, I heard of this guy, Wim Hof, he was climbing mountains in the snow, and doing some pretty crazy stuff. And I was just intrigued at the time, honestly. I didn't really have the mechanistic understanding that I do now, but I just saw this guy doing some pretty wild stuff, and I like to dive into stuff head first. So I started practicing the Wim Hof method, and I just saw everything that they kind of touted as the benefits I saw immediately. And then I just kind of started diving into the underlying physiology and what happens to the nervous system, and it just honestly made a lot of sense. I'm like, of course it does these things. So I flew to the Netherlands, spent a week with Wim, and this is probably 6 years ago now. Flew back, you spend a couple of days with him in Poland, and we hike a mountain in the snow. In a pair of boardies. It was minus 15 Celsius.
So that's legit.
From the tropics.
I read that in the book. That's legit.
It's legit,
Oh, wild.
Honestly, I thought it was going to be like grit your teeth and bear it, right? Just like trudge up this mountain. And it was not. It was very much, I felt warm, I felt comfortable, I felt calm. the moment I let my mind wander, I was chatting to someone, it's like you felt the cold just creeping back in, and it was get my mind back on this present moment and just kind of regulate, right? Like if I can tell my nervous system I'm actually good, then my nervous system knows what to do. You know, like I can't remember who said it, but it's like our ancestors like crossed glaciers on foot. You know, it's like we have the capacity to deal with cold weather. We just don't like it.
Yeah.
You know, like we have this inbuilt thermoregulation. And so if I'm stuck there struggling and fighting and resisting, then we don't turn that system on. And so it's really eye-opening for me. You know, I still remember that, and I think that was honestly like one of those moments where I'm just like, oh, you know, I didn't think I would be able to do this, and I can. You know, how often do we tell ourselves I can't do that? That's too hard. That's not for me. And I just think that's a mindset thing.
Yeah.
Incredible. So did you, were you instructed to do like breath work prior to walking up the mountain to prep yourself, or was the breath work something you were constantly doing whilst you were doing it to regulate body temperature?
Yeah, honestly, a little bit of both, right?
Okay.
So morning of, it's like there's a group of 50 of us, and it's do some like blast off breath work.
Okay.
You know, like Wim's there just like driving the energy up. And it's a little bit of visualization. You know, it's like get myself into that state and then kind of almost mentally rehearse what it's going to be like. During the walk, it's much more like keeping yourself in a steady state. So you're not doing the Wim Hof method. There's no hyperventilation. It's much more like a slow, steady, rhythmical breath. You know, the way I always teach, breathing is kind of a line of communication to your nervous system. And so think of someone having a panic attack, right? Like that breath is telling the nervous system something's going wrong. And so if you're hiking a mountain in the snow and it's short, shallow, rapid breath, your nervous system thinks this is a dangerous environment. If my breath is slow, steady, rhythmical, low in my body, that sends a message of like, we're good, you know, and the nervous system responds to that. And so it's such a powerful lesson for us in terms of just like, what is my breath telling my nervous system about the state of the world, right? Like, is the world safe or is it scary? That's going to change how my nervous system responds, like all the way down to the allocation of resources. You know, like, am I in this fight, flight, threat detection, action, survival state, or am I in this like safe, restorative, regenerative capacity? A lot of that, it's not just the breath, you know, but the breath I find is this like lowest hanging fruit, very easy to access, and has more or less an immediate impact on the nervous system.
Sounds like breath is the source of everything. Like it starts with the breath, and then everything else your body is in touch with just feeds off from that. Does that sound right? Like it sounds like it's so ingrained in everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I take it. And it's not always, right? Like until I had that moment in a clinical setting where it just made me think about it, and then these experiences I've had subsequently. But I do come back to that, you know, there's kind of emerging research, and this is still, I guess, suggested rather than confirmed, that what triggers a baby to be born is its lungs, right? Kind of demanding it's time for me to breathe. You know, what happens, the first thing we do is we take a breath. The last thing we do before we die is take a breath. You know, between those 2 points, we're breathing. We have this ability to relegate the things that happen a lot. You know, I always use this example, like no one can really feel clothing touching their skin right now until I just said that, right? The moment I said that, it's like, oh, you know, my perception shifts. It's like, oh yeah, I can feel my t-shirt, right? But you couldn't feel it 10 seconds ago because you're not paying attention to it. Breathing happens 20 to 25,000 times a day, you know? And so imagine if we noticed every single one, you'd get nothing else done, right? So the brain kind of relegates it. And so we assume that it's just like, it's on autopilot, it's just running itself. And that's partly true. But then we start to look at, you know, what influences our breath, and things like our posture and our phones and our chronic stress and our lack of sleep and our nutrient, you know, it's like, so those things impact the breath and the breath impacts the nervous system. If we kind of just continue to play catch up and whack-a-mole with the downstream impacts of that, instead of actually taking control of something like our breath, I think we just run around in circles.
Do we start off, I thought I read it, please confirm it if it's complete nonsense, but when we're babies, our bodies naturally know how to breathe correctly, like diaphragmatic breathing or whatever, belly breathing. But as we get older as adults, we get lazy in our breathing and it becomes shallow and like top lung heavy as opposed to proper diaphragmatic breathing. Is there anything to that?
Absolutely. And I think that starts, you know, like we can point the finger at what the culprit is or what the cause is. And I think some of that starts with, you know, as far down the line as footwear. You know, like you look at a kid up to 5 or 6, how they breathe, it's beautiful. We start putting them in shoes, we start putting them in chairs. breathing changes. You know, like the posture that we put ourselves in, we adapt to, you know, and sitting is a relatively new thing. You know, when we're talking evolutionarily, we didn't used to sit for 5-6 hours a day as from young as 5-year-olds. You know, like the diaphragm changes position, the rib cage changes its orientation when we're sitting versus mobilizing. You know, so what does that do that we start sitting and we start wearing shoes with a big heel on them, and that kind of shifts our biomechanics? So I think it's not just we get lazy. I think there's these environmental influences that kind of negatively impact breath. The tricky part for a lot of people, you know, I've thought about this often, is most of the symptoms of dysfunctional breathing aren't breathing. No one comes to me and be like, oh, I've got all these issues with my breathing, I need your help. No. Right? They come to me with anxiety, lack of energy, they can't sleep, you know, emotional lability. Like none of it is really breathing, but that doesn't mean breathing's not involved. And so I think we somewhat kind of gloss over the importance of breathing because it's not presenting itself as an issue. But look at rates of anxiety, look at rates of chronic stress, panic attacks, like that should tell us that there's something wrong with the system. And again, I kind of find that the access point for all of us is breathing.
Incredible.
What's the like timeline from when someone sees you for the first time? It could be like different depending on what they're working through, but is it kind of like you can have a session with someone, teach them how, you know, breathe through their diaphragm, and then after that it's like a one and done, and they have the tools to be able to do that for themselves? Or is it something that would be like a little bit more ongoing?
Definitely a little bit more ongoing. You know, it sometimes blows my mind as to what can change in one session. You know, because if someone can take away from that, you know, how to change this thing, right, that happens so much. Like if we think of the cumulative effect of 20,000 times a day, day in, day out, week in, week out, you know, like, and then beyond, that little shift that can happen in 1 or 2 sessions, right, if they're then consistent with, we're talking, you know, hundreds of thousands of not millions of repetitions over the next year or so. But dysfunctional breathing doesn't arise overnight. You know, no one comes to me and the issue started yesterday. Maybe they've been breathing poorly for a decade. Right. And so we always want to set that realistic expectation. It's like, it took you 10 years to get here. We're not going to fix it overnight. And I think that's really important for people to understand. You know, like this is a journey that you go on. It's not like, oh, I'm just going to fix my breathing and it's done. It takes time, you know, and I have to address a lot of things. Like I really teach breathing through kind of 4 pillars, which is biomechanics, physiology, nervous system, and emotions. And sometimes people have good and bad in all or some of those pillars. And so we kind of really have to dive into like, what does the individual need? And I would argue, and this is, you know, what I teach a lot, that regardless of what your goals are, you know, whether I'm working with an athlete, a CEO, a mom with postpartum anxiety, I know for a fact that addressing and improving the mechanics, physiology, nervous system, and emotions is going to have a positive impact on whatever it is their goals are. And it brings us to a point that I think's, you know, if I share my kind of grand vision and goal, it's not just kind of teaching breathwork, but it's kind of changing the way we look at health. You know, we don't have a healthcare system anymore. We have a symptom management, disease management system. And people often ask me, it's like, oh, does breathwork fix X? And it's just really the wrong question. You know, does breathwork support the person who's experiencing X? Absolutely. Like I'm 100% certain of that in any case. Whereas if someone says, oh, was it going to fix my cancer? Is it going to fix my high blood pressure? Is it going to fix my cardiac disease? You know, it's like, it's a different question. But when we start focusing on the person, not the problem, the systems, not the symptoms, I think we just start to see very different outcomes.
And that's a symptom of, I think, current culture of big pharma. And everyone wants a solution right now. And the solution is this X medication prescribed to you. How do you go to a doctor and get a prescription for do 20, you know, diaphragmatic breathings over the next 6 to 12 months?
Right. And, you know, forgive the cynic and the pessimist in me, but you can't make any money from that, right? Like it's a poor business model to teach someone a free skill that is very, very effective. You know, and sometimes I do like catch my cynicism with that, but we've just got mounting evidence of that, you know, that the healthcare system isn't really set up to get people healthy. It's to have a long-term customer.
So where do people sort of start then? Like you obviously said, this is something that needs to be built in over time and people need to develop the skills. Where would you say is a good starting point for someone that might be listening?
Such a good question. It's honestly my favorite question because, you know, I teach this kind of framework, which I'll go through with you guys, of awareness, control, optimization. A lot of people want to start with control. teach me an exercise to help with my anxiety.
Yeah.
Right? I want to control the thing. But if you don't know what's making you anxious, you're now reliant on symptom management again, right? It's a different form. It's not necessarily a pill for the ill, but it's like, oh, this thing's coming up and let me control it. One step upstream of your anxiety is, a stimulus. If I can start to build the awareness of, well, when I do feel anxious, am I talking to a certain person? Am I underslept? Am I hungry? Are my blood sugars low? Have I drank too much caffeine? It's like anxiety doesn't often just happen. But we don't spend a lot of time focusing on like what was the environmental condition, for example, that triggered my anxiety. We see this really, really strong correlation between how someone's breathing and how they're feeling, right? Like what does someone who's really anxious look like in terms of their breath? We can kind of see that, right? There's like short, shallow, it stops, start, right? It's up in the chest and the neck. And so often people feel this symptom of anxiety, right? And they're like, oh, I got to prevent it or I got to turn it off. If I can help people build the awareness of like, well, how are you breathing prior to you feeling anxiety? Now we can do something about it, and it's not just in the moment, but if people develop a little bit more awareness of how their breathing patterns correlate to their emotional states, right? Like the example that everyone understands without me even having to explain it is how do you breathe when you're frustrated, right? Like we don't decide to do that. That's an automatic response. When my nervous system is informing, right? Like my breath is informing us of the state of my nervous system, right? But breathing both affects and reflects. And so if I notice that's my frustrated breath, if I notice what my anxious breathing looks like, if I notice what my calm breathing looks like, then I can start to use that breathing pattern to inform my state. And so when I'm feeling anxious and I need to feel calm, I can breathe like I'm calm because I've paid attention to what calm breathing feels like. And so there's a lot of this legwork that has to happen early, which is like, you need to plant these flags in the sand to be like, this is what calm feels like for my nervous system, for my breathing. This is what excited feels like. This is what apprehensive feels like. And so often people want to skip that step. It's like, just give me the tool, man. Just teach me how to not be anxious. And I'm like, well, right, you come to the wrong person.
Done.
But that's current culture, man. We want it right now.
And so that awareness piece, it just like, there's not a lot of the quick return of investment, right? Like we don't get the instant gratification. We don't fix the problem. But long term, we're actually identifying what is the root cause of my anxiety or my pain or whatever it might be. And so from there, we can go to control. It's like now I'm far more effective at choosing the tool that I need because I've built the awareness around why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. And then finally, we can get to optimization, right? Which is things like Wim Hof method breathing, ice baths, like building resilience and capacity into the system. Everyone wants to start there, but they've failed to recognize why they need the tool, what's the tool they need. Now I can kind of play with the knobs and the dials and really like optimize the system.
I've just learned something already.
I've
done what I did the step after all the pre-steps. So I've just gone, breathing exercise. Okay, I'll diagnose it with Wim Hof breathing. And then I've just gone straight to that. And I mean, a lot of this podcast is we're trying to just jump to this is the productivity hack or the bio hack. And it's, obviously that's my naivety and that's probably why you're on the show. I wanted to learn it straight from the pro. Yeah.
Do you find like you've had to have like a little bit of an open mind, obviously coming up through being like a physio and it's like, I guess, traditional medicine, and then you've kind of explored all these different avenues. Have you come across anything where you're like, either that's like a little bit too woo-woo or like, I never thought I would have adopted something like this, but now I'm like a massive believer in it? Is there anything you've come across like that?
Breathwork. I used to call breathwork my dirty little secret. It's like, and I would not use it clinically because I was like, that's some woo-woo bullshit, right? Like until I spent enough time reading research, practicing, right? Like getting the experiential understanding. But now, we see like reams of research to support breathwork, for stress, for anxiety, for chronic pain, for energy, for fatigue. But at the time I was like, this is some crazy, it's like, I didn't understand the mechanism. So I put it in that bucket of like woo-woo stuff that I don't understand. Which right, of now it's literally what I teach everyone, makes me then a little bit more cautious to call shit woo-woo. I thought this was, and it's now like literally the main thing of my personal practice, my professional career, and so I see these other things where I hear my brain going, that looks like some woo-woo. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what you said about breathwork. Right? So
and here we are.
What else works?
Go to Campbell's house, there's dream catchers everywhere. It's just like, no, I thought they were woo-woo, they're real.
I'm on to it. No, that's really, really cool. So like things like you talk about shoes before, so like grounding, like the mouth taping. Like, do you see things that come in that could be perceived as fads, but actually do have like the scientific research behind them?
Yeah, I think, you know, particularly, again, I think we kind of like put these things in buckets. Like grounding's got a lot of research behind it, but it's some hippy dippy bullshit. You know, it's like, but it's not if you actually look. You know, and so I think the N=1 is a really important thing.
Yeah.
You know, if you take your shoes off and you spend 10 minutes every day with your feet in the grass, do you feel better? If you don't worry about it.
Yeah.
If you do, that's all the evidence you need.
Yeah.
You know, like we have to draw a line and be cautious of like, yes, randomized controlled trials and clinical research and all this stuff is super important to validate the experience. And validate's maybe not the right word, but to kind of confirm the biases that people have and is it applicable, is it safe, is it approachable on a broad scale? But prior to that, you know, people always ask me, it's like, where's the trial that was done for this? I'm like, I don't need one because it's for me. You know, it's like, I feel better when I spend some time with my feet in the ground. I feel better when I get sunlight in my eyes. Not because Huberman told me to, but I mean, it is because that's what caused me to start
what
it.
Huberman says we do.
Right? Because once I started it, I'm like, shit, I sleep way better. I have more energy. I'm more motivated. Like, I don't need necessarily the research to tell me it works. And so I think a lot of these things, there is an element of, they work. And whether we come back to like how much of this is placebo effect and the positive expectancy bias. But instead of discounting it because of that, I think we should dive into that head first and be like, who cares how and why it works if it works?
That's 100%. Are you able to share any profound experiences or breakthroughs that you've seen in your clients by doing it?
Yeah. I have to come back to breathwork, but you know, we'll steer into what feels like a little bit more woo-woo because that's where we're going. You know,
Lock in, let's do it.
Prior to that, you know, I see improvements in blood pressure and stress and anxiety and sleep and energy and all the things that we see breathwork doing. I remember this one client that we were doing these more experiential types of breathwork. And they'd shared, well, this all actually came out after the breathwork session. And he just kind of stopped and said, I'd like to share just what happened. He said, for a really long time, like I lost my father at a young age and I now have a partner and it's always like eaten me up inside that I never got to introduce my partner to my dad. He's like, and I just did. You know, in that session, like I just had this very real experience of actually introducing my partner to my dad and like coming out of that, you know, my brain goes to like, how do we explain the mechanism why that worked? What was happening with neurotransmitters and brainwaves? And I think we need to leave a bit of room for the magic rather than try and explain everything. I'm a very objective-minded person, and so I want to understand what was going on in the brain, right? What was going on in brain waves, neurotransmitters, but I don't know if it needs to be explained through mechanism because the look on this guy's face of just utter and sheer relief is probably what it looked like. That for him, it didn't matter what was going on in his brain. He got to do the thing that he needed to do. And lots of these experiences, I had another client not so long ago that we kind of went into, we'd been doing a lot of the restorative side of stuff, and she kind of came in one day and just said, like, I really feel like blocked and I'm struggling and I'm kind of hit a plateau. Like, let's dive in and do a little bit more like the deeper breath work. And it's not something I do with a lot of clients early on because I really want to make sure they have the capacity to do it. I think there's a lot of unsafe breath work
like
practices.
Physically or emotionally or?
Both, but mainly emotionally. You know, like we put someone into a state, you know, like breath work is a very, very reliable way to alter someone's state of consciousness, if we want to call it that. But that kind of opens the can, you know, for some stuff to come up. And this is why we see, you know, you type in breath work and you see people screaming and you have all these emotional releases. That can be very re-traumatizing to someone if not done in the right context, with the right support, integration, etc. So I'm much more conservative probably than a lot of other breathwork teachers because I just don't want someone to have a shitty experience. But we decided to jump in, and this is like 15, 20 minutes something before we stopped, and tears were streaming down her face, and she's like, again, it's funny where these things come back to. And so when we started, it wasn't like, let's go back to this memory. There was no pre-framing, right? It was just like, let's do it and see what happens. And she's like, I lost my dad. I didn't know any of this. She's like, I lost my dad. He was a sailor and he went out to sea one day and he never came back. And I was like 5 or 6. And she's like, I just got to say goodbye, you know? And again, I'm like, the fuck just happened? You know, who cares what happened? You know, again, her whole demeanor changed, her whole energy changed, right? She got to have this closure of an event that had been plaguing her for 40 years, right? Like, and I don't need to explain necessarily how that happened. I can put a proposed theory together, but I think it's really important that we just kind of leave a bit of space for the magic.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, just while you're talking about like what's a safe practice and not a safe practice, is there like a push to try and get like accreditation through breathwork teachers to make sure that the people that are doing this work are doing it safely and not just, you know, come down and I'll give you this really emotional experience, but, you know, I'm not trained to or I'm not ready to.
So there's I don't know how, you know, like breathwork's a pretty cowboy world.
Yeah.
There's nothing stopping anyone in this room being like, I'm a breathwork teacher.
Yeah.
Right? There really isn't. There's no accreditation board. There's no national, you know, it's like, so it kind of comes back to, you know, why we run the certification that we do is because I want clinicians and practitioners to approach this safely and not give breathwork a bad name, because it's very easy, right? People can do stupid things and have very bad outcomes. And then it just discounts the whole thing. It's like, oh, breathwork's some dangerous thing, right? Well, it is if you don't respect the contraindications, the precautions, if you don't, you know, respect set and setting. And so there are, you know, like the certification that we teach is certified through this International Board of Holistic Medicine. But it's few and far between in my experience. You know, I think there are more and more certifications that are coming out that are grounded in the science and the safety. But that doesn't stop anyone being like, I did a 1-day course and I'm going to host these big workshops with 50 people. And not everyone comes out of that better than they went in.
You said that awareness was that first initial step. Do you think there's something around like the mass population of just trying to sort of avoid those negative emotions, or trying to just stick away from it? Like, it's
a really good question. You know, we can sit here and tout all the benefits of breathwork. It can be an escapism practice for a lot of people, right? I'm feeling a certain something and I just like self-regulate away from that. You know, it's like I'm feeling something uncomfortable and I'm just going to breathe my way back to bliss. Maybe you need to address why you feel uncomfortable. Maybe, you know, it's like, I think we can use it, and hopefully a lot of people do use it as a very therapeutic tool, but I do see it kind of take that form of just another behavior that takes me away from the work that maybe I need to do.
Yeah, because I've seen that a lot as well in terms of even myself. It's easy to look at things like, again, like say ice baths or all these other little hacks that might make you feel better, but then you're sort of like using those to get back up to feeling better rather than Band-Aid solution instead of like actually facing some of the demons that you might have or facing those negative emotions that you want to get away from. Yeah,
I think it's a really, really kind of important point. And I do, you know, we're at this culture that we kind of touched on a couple of times, just optimize the hell out of everything. You know, and does it leave any space for you to actually be self-aware of noticing what you need, you know? And I think a great example of this is like wearables now, you know, the Whoop strap, the Oura ring. It's like someone wakes up in the morning and checks their readiness score instead of checking in with their body. You know, what happens when your battery dies? Like, I don't know whether to work out or take a nap. You know, it's like, I don't know how I feel because I've outsourced that information to some data.
They're going off their day based on, like, say, they didn't get, I don't know, 8 hours sleep, don't feel like 100% rested. And then they're like, oh, my day's done. I'm not going to be productive.
And you look at like the accuracy of a lot of these wearables is not that good. You know, it's not like clinical grade hospital, you know, tracking your sleep cycles and everything. It's like, it's this thing on your finger, you know, that based on how much you move, it's taking a guess at how long you're in REM sleep, et cetera. So that maybe isn't as accurate, you know, and I wake up in the morning and I check a number to decide how hard do I push myself today instead of checking in with myself, you know? I think it's a really interesting thing that we outsource self-awareness. You know, it's like, I'd rather a computer tell me whether I'm fighting fit or I'm under the weather rather than like actually understanding what my body's telling me.
God, so thank God the pod's not sponsored by Whoop. That would have been.
But we will still take sponsorship if it's out there.
Cut that.
When you're talking about like obviously the years like that you've done the research in this space, and you said all the different types of people you work with, whether it's athletes, you know, mental health, things like that. Is it like you've had to research breath work within each category of that person, or it's kind of like a central practice with those pillars that translates across to everything?
Yeah, it's much more the latter. And I can only say that now. You know, early on it was, how does breathwork work for this specific presentation? A lot of what we teach, it's a breathwork program, a lot of it is an unlearning, you know, of the traditional medical management system that we get taught, you know, as a physio, as a nurse, as a doctor. It's very much, right, like we take a set of symptoms, we use that to give a diagnosis, and the diagnosis gives us a treatment plan. People can have different symptoms from the same core disruption, right? Like we all go underslept for a couple of days. You might feel irritable, you might feel anxious, you might feel really fatigued, I might have more pain. So if we use symptoms to then diagnose me with pain, you with anxiety, you with chronic fatigue, and you with something else, you're going to get different medication, right? Different management. The same problem, right? Sorry, the same cause, right? It's just we're underslept, hasn't been addressed because we're using symptoms rather than what's upstream of symptoms. And so, you know, when I first dove into it, it was very much, I was still using that part of my brain, which is like use a set of symptoms to diagnose a condition to then work out what the treatment is. And now I've really shifted away from symptom management to what I would just call health creation, right? Like what does the person need, right? Are they underslept? Do they need different nutrients, nourishment? Are they moving? Right? Like, how are they breathing? Like, how can we support the person rather than use their symptoms to tell us what to do? And I get very different outcomes. And so it almost feels and sounds a little bit like I'm saying breathwork is a panacea and fixes everything, you know, and it's not what I'm saying. But when we look at the impact that it has on the autonomic nervous system, which is the remote, it's the operating system of our entire body. You know, when we optimize that and we correct dysfunction there and we restore balance, all of the other symptoms that come from that disruption may improve, you know? And so we see that these kind of seemingly random presentations and sets of symptoms self-correct rather than it's like, oh, breathwork fixed X. It's like, no, breathwork helped us recalibrate the nervous system or, you know, address your emotional state and maybe suppressed emotion, whatever it might be. That it's that kind of correction of the underlying system that causes the symptoms to change rather than anything we did to kind of beat back the symptoms with a stick.
Is it do you see it as like a lead treatment or somewhat of a support treatment to traditional physio recommendations that you would have done, you know, previously?
Yeah, so I see it now, right? It's the first thing we should teach. I don't care whether you're a physio, a yoga teacher, a doctor, a dentist, right? Like, because it's something that we're doing 20, 25,000 times a day, you know, it's like, it's only going to enhance all your other skill sets, right? So I can talk to the chiropractor or the physio or the massage therapist, and he's like, if we don't address the underlying dysfunction that someone has, which is they're breathing like shit 20,000 times a day, it doesn't matter the other skill sets you have, right? Like they're just going to patch up, you know, a shaky foundation. Whereas if we start with like, let's correct this thing that keeps you alive, you know, like that is so involved in you actually producing energy and removing waste and, you know, kind of relaying information to your heart, to your brain, right, about the state of the world. Like if we correct that early on, and then I can bring in nutrition or movement or exercise prescription or all these other tools, then those things are going to work better because we've built a solid foundation. And so rather, yes, it's a supplement, but I think it's like the primary step that then once we've laid this foundation of like, now this person's physiology, their nervous system is supported, what are the other tools that I can bring in? And there's a myriad of those, right? Like, but I think if it's so often that I have a client that comes to me that's like, I've tried all the things, right? Like I've supplements, all my dietary changes, I've done all these different things. And it's like, yeah, we got to go back to basics. You're not breathing well, you know? And I think there's sometimes a little bit of a discomfort that comes up for people, particularly when I talk to doctors, right? Yeah. That it's like, you mean you're saying it's that simple, right? Like all of this, like 10 years of education I have, and you're telling me it comes back to breathing? And I'm like, yeah, I am. Again, this is not saying that it fixes everything, but oftentimes when the people that have tried everything, we come back and we're like, yeah, but you're in this state, right, of like pursuit and chasing and like everything I'm doing is this kind of like battle, right, to manage the symptoms that I have instead of us just addressing like, how well is your system functioning? You know, and if we come back to something like you're breathing through your mouth into your chest 30,000 times a day, you know, you're breathing too fast, your nervous system's in a constant state of threat detection, right? Like we do not engage in states of longevity when we're running away from a tiger. And so your nervous system thinks you're running away from a tiger all day, right? Like what can come from that is inflammation, autoimmunity, you know, cancer, like all those things can come downstream of this like disruption of the way that I live, right? My nervous system. And unless we correct that, I think we just fall back into this system of like, let's keep managing the symptoms that are arising.
As more research comes out, are you seeing the adoption of breathwork by the wider medical community at all?
I think it's still too woo-woo.
Yeah.
Too early.
I think it is. I think, you know, people like Huberman, and he often mentions Jack Feldman, who's like one of these leading researchers in breathwork. Like these are big name people, you know, it's like they are leading the medical ward at Stanford or at Harvard, or, you know, it's like they're really top tier researchers. Like this is not your just nobodies. And so I think as these platforms like Huberman Lab and, you know, start to disseminate information that it's like there is clinical peer-reviewed research to support how this works. Like this isn't woo-woo, you know, but I think we're still at that kind of like trickle-down effect. You know, there's stats that tell us, I can't remember what the numbers are, but it's something crazy like what happens in research today isn't taught in medical school for 10 or 15 years. You know, it's like that time period is just, it's silly. You know, so, and this is why I think when we're always waiting for the research instead of taking like the experience, we just delay, you know, what could be something I implement today or tomorrow rather than in 10 years because I trust that my body will tell me if it's good for me or not.
I think a massive part of it as well too is like what you're doing and what Wim Hof is like with that exposure and getting explained. Like initially walking into this room today, I saw breathwork as something you use to optimize, like make your life better rather than like a treatment for, you know, all these different ailments or just like overall improving your life. So I think getting that message out there of like what the purpose behind breathwork actually is will kind of have more people adopting it as well too. What do you have, what's your message to like, you see obviously all these like, you know, young teenagers and things like that picking up vaping and the effect that that's going to have on like their breathwork and their just ability to breathe and standard of life. Do you see that a lot or?
And not just something like vaping, you know, it's like we can look at that because it's very prevalent and it's very relevant right now. But, you know, you look at, again, if we look at the research from about 2011, we just see this spike in anxiety, self-harm, depression, suicidal ideation, right? Particularly in young girls. What happened in 2011 is we got the first rear-facing camera on our phone and Instagram, you know? So it's like, yes, we could be like, well, correlation, causation. It's like something happened there, you know, because we see this hockey stick spike of anxiety, you know, particularly in adolescent boys and girls, worse for girls, right? This idea, you know, this like phone and we won't necessarily have to talk, right? Because I think everyone's aware of, you know, the pitfalls of social media. But what I think's just as interesting is like, you know, our visual field, when we're focused on this little screen 10 inches from our face, right? It puts us, again, it changes our autonomic arousal, right? My brain kind of goes on high alert when I focus on stuff. Imagine you being attacked by a tiger. You're not like panoramic vision, look at the trees. You're like, that's the thing that's going to get me. You know, so where we spend, and, you know, you look at the research now, it's 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day on your phone. What's that doing to your nervous system? You know, and so we can again look at anxiety as a symptom and how do we manage anxiety? Like, what if that anxiety is caused by this overstimulation, right? A recent study came out that showed that when you're on your phone, your lung capacity goes down 30%. So like 5, 6 hours a day, you're reducing your ability to breathe, which delivers less oxygen, which, you know, it's like, again, we just see this like snowball effect of something as simple as that. But what I'd kind of like to bring that conversation back to, you know, it's like whether we look at vaping, whether we look at alcohol, coffee, anything, right? I personally believe all these things are just an attempt at self-regulation. I think everything we do is an attempt at self-regulation. Why do you call your mom? Why do you call your mate? You know, why do you grab a beer? Why do you roll a joint? You know, it's like there is a desire for a shift in how you feel, whether you're aware of it or not, right? Or conscious of it or not. I often find that that is this driving force of why I do anything, you know, and it's not all negative things, right? Why do people exercise? Why do you want to run? Why do you go to the gym? It changes how you feel, you know? And so if we come back to like, what is the vape doing for someone? You know, it's like, there's a desire to shift how I feel. The question for me is not like, oh, well, how do we get rid of vapes? It's like, how do we provide an alternative to get that same shift in my state? You know, like we as a human species have always altered our state. It's not new, right? It's just the mechanism, like, oh, I'm using a vape, or I used to be using alcohol, or I used to be using something else, right? Dance, drumming, singing, you know, it's like these are all attempts to shift my state. So kind of coming back to awareness, you know, when I feel like I need to reach and pick up the vape, what's my current state and where am I trying to get to? Am I stressed and want to feel calm? Am I agitated and want to slow down? You know, if I can become more aware of that, right? And then it's like, what else can get me there? You know, I have breathing practices that replace a cup of coffee. I have breathing practices that replace a glass of wine. You know, so if anyone gets home at the end of the day, it's like, traffic was shitty, my boss was an asshole today. It's like, I just need a glass of wine to wind down, right? Like the glass of wine, right? Alcohol is a nervous system depressant, right? Like it has a very reliable impact. How else can you get that glass of wine? You know, like, is there a way that you can shift yourself into the state that the wine is going to take you to? And this isn't to say, you know, well, now you have to be sober. And it's like, I drink wine, right? And I enjoy a glass of wine here and there, but I've learned that I can replace that. And so it doesn't become a crutch. Wow. Coffee's the other great one, you know, like if you wake up and you have to have your coffee before you can take on the world.
Function, yeah.
I would argue that's a crutch that you maybe want to become aware of. You know, like what happens if you wake up and you're out of beans or your coffee shop's closed? Like, are you an asshole now?
Yeah.
Like maybe you should check that relationship. Is there a different way you can pick yourself up when you're feeling flat? Yeah. Of course there is. You just need to stimulate your nervous system, you know? And so coming back to the question that the point that you made of like, you know, breathwork becoming less of a thing that we do on our yoga mat, you know, and more of an integrated part of how we live our life. Like, I think everything we do is breathwork, right? You sigh, you yawn, you laugh, you cry, you know, whether it's intentional or not is a different question, but all of these things are kind of ways that you're self-regulating.
Do you, I think you alluded to it with like reduction, I suppose maybe in your alcohol consumption. How has breath work personally transformed your life?
Yeah, the big ones for me is, you know, I've never been a super anxious person. I've always been pretty like low-key and chill, but even since starting that, like I just have more time, you know, like between stimulus and response. Someone cuts me off, someone says something happens at work, you know, my ability to not react to that, I kind of pull back to like, this has come from a breath practice. So that kind of like space between stimulus and response, I think is the most obvious thing for me. Second to that is probably energy. You know, I've got a 2-year-old at the moment, and the sleep disruption that occurs in the first 2 years of life is wild, you know? And I kind of like wonder how much harder my day-to-day would be if I didn't have a practice, you know, such as help me reset when he's having a rough time, you know, help me pick myself up when it's like, you know what, I've got a string of calls to do today and I had 4 hours sleep last night. Like, I don't want to punch 4 coffees, you know, because that's going to impact how I sleep tonight. And it just like, you kick the can down the road. And so my ability to be like, that's probably not the best decision. It's 2:00 today. I don't want to drink. Like if I drink coffee after 12, I'm screwed that night. I've just learned that about myself. But if I didn't have breathing, I'd be like, but I'm so fatigued and I need, you know, I've got to get on this podcast or whatever it might be. And so then it just puts you in a sticky situation. It's like, all right, I'll just drink the coffee, get through the thing. I'll deal with poor sleep again tonight. You know, it's like tomorrow starts on the back foot as well. Yeah. And so I think that ability to kind of like influence my energy is probably the second big thing that I've noticed.
Okay.
Yeah. Is it something that you've ever like throughout your day to day that you're not continuously keeping up though? Like, is there other points where you actually like don't catch yourself catching onto the stimulus or anything that? Like, or are you just perfect? Like,
no, you know, it's like and it's such a good point because people are always, you know, whenever I share something like that on Instagram, you're like, you know what? Today I was shitty with all of my stuff, right? Yeah. It's like people are like, oh, I just thought you had it all worked out. It's like, hell no. I'll catch myself doing something with my breathing and I'm like, how long have I been doing this for? You know, or I'll be sitting down at work and it's been 4 hours since I stood up and I'm like, why does my back hurt? And it's like, oh, because I've been sitting in a chair for 4 hours, you know, like we can't, I think there's this risk of just optimizing everything to a T. You know, it's like sometimes you just let yourself be human, you know, and you catch yourself. And I definitely find that retrospectively, I often pick up on things. You know, it's like, fuck, this week was really hard. Like, I didn't do any breath work this week. I did not wake up and I didn't do my practice. And I was, you know, I stopped exercising. It's like, oh, you know, like it would have been great if I realized on Wednesday, hey, I've skipped my practice the last couple of days. But I didn't. It got to Friday and I was, you know, I had a rough week and it's like, I haven't been doing the things that I know help me feel better, you know, let me make a better attempt next week. But that happens all the time, you know, like at a new phase of my business, I have a new child, right? My wife's pregnant at the moment. So it's like, I know there's going to be these periods where my breath work takes a back seat. Yeah. I think that's okay. You know, it usually takes me getting to a point of like, I'm being an asshole. I'm struggling with this. This is really hard. I'm like, oh, I haven't done any of my shit in a couple of weeks. Like, let me re-engage in those things.
Where's the balance between that where you're sort of keeping yourself on track and also being sort of kind to yourself? We had Claudia from Kind Studio on one of our early episodes and definitely talked about being kind to yourself and finding that balance when running a business. So
yeah, it's funny you asked that question. I was just chatting with a few people about this, right? Like that line between having high standards of like how I want to show up and also just not being so hard on myself. Yeah. You know, I don't really have a good answer to that. I think it's kind of, I guess what I'd say is, you know, I think we often think that balance is like being in the middle. And I think it's more like touching the edges, you know? So it's like finding yourself veering to one side or the other so that you know that you have a bigger middle ground, right? If I just stay right in the middle and I don't know where the edges are, like, I think that's a pretty delicate place to be, because it doesn't take much to tip me over the edge. And whereas if I like stretch the capacity or the boundaries, and it's like, okay, I didn't do anything for a couple of weeks and this is where I got to, and I did it every single day for a month and this is where I got to. It's like, now I got these like set points and these boundaries, and like now I'm pretty confident with where the middle is for me. And then when I start to veer towards one or the other side, it's like, oh wait, I'm being obsessive, let me just chill out a bit. Or it's like, I haven't done anything, let me pick up my practices again. So I think it's a constant, you know, using feedback to drive, you know, future behavior, and just kind of like finding that happy medium.
Yeah, like they sort of talk about like consistency over intensity then, like at least showing up and being able to do something to sort of help yourself out, rather than feeling like you have to show up every single day at 100%.
Yeah.
That's sort of the difference there.
100%. You know, like some days I do 5 minutes and I'm like, that's all that's what I got today, you know? And yes, would I feel better if I did 30 minutes? Of course, but I didn't have 30 minutes, or it didn't seem like I had 30 minutes, you know? It's like, I think you can always make the time, but there's so many things vying for our attention and what we need to be doing. So I think that like having a little bit rather than it's all or nothing, because I think you can fall into it. Like, and I talk to my clients about this all the time. I'm like, you know, how are your practices this week? Like, actually, I didn't do anything. Like, I haven't been able to find half an hour every day. It's like, just do 3 minutes then. You know, they're like, oh, well, you know, they feel that it's like, if I don't do 30 minutes, what's the point? You know, it's like same as people going to the gym. It's like, I got to go for an hour. It's like, but going for 10 minutes is still going to help. It's better than 0 minutes, you know, but we don't do that. We're like, it's this amount or what's the point?
Or nothing,
Right? And I think that sets us up. Like, either it is very hard to maintain that long term because I'm just pushing myself too hard, you know, or I go through these periods of boom and bust, right? It's like I smash the gym every day for a month and then I didn't go for 4 months. You know, I think there's a happy medium again of like, you know, I've been somewhat consistent forever.
Is there like a spiritual aspect to breathwork?
Short answer, yes. You know, I think it's to me, the biggest, if I think of like what breathwork has done in terms of like the spiritual side of things, to me, it's like, it's a connector, right? Like, and if I think of it connects me better to myself, it connects me better to other people, and it connects me better to something bigger. You know, the experience that I've had with breathwork that kind of peel back the veil a little bit, where it's like, oh wait, you know, there is this sense or this feeling, you know, that maybe I can't articulate, but I do feel that I would call that a spiritual, you know, experience in a way. It's funny, right? It's one of those words that, you know, as soon as you say spiritual, my head goes to religion. I'm like, those two things are very separate. But my upbringing, and I went to a Catholic school, it's like, as soon as someone says spiritual, I think religion. I'm like, oh, and I like get my hackles up. And it's like, but I now have this access point, right, that is removed from any ideology, any dogma, right? Like breath can be my spiritual practice, and it's not controlled or regulated or preached in any way. So I think it has, for me, become that sense of connection to something that's a little bit bigger than myself and what I understand.
I'd be really interested. We've done a little bit of breath work one time together at the Cool to Be Conscious morning. How did you guys sort of find it when we did it that time? Because I think that was like 10 minutes.
I had a weird experience. It wasn't spiritual. I had a weird physical experience. I don't know. I've never had it before when I've done breath work, but all my muscles clenched up. And they were forcing us to do mouth breathing when I thought...
At gunpoint forcing us.
Sometimes what it feels like, right? Like, go to these big workshops.
Whereas like, I thought proper breathing technique was through the nose, out through the mouth, and diaphragmatic breathing. And I've never had the sensation of...
Clenching up.
The tensioning up. That was my experience.
That was your experience.
Right? And I'd love to just sit on this for a minute because it's a really important point. Did it detract from you having a positive experience? You know, like, was the physical sensation strong and almost over? You know, it's like, because there's a train of thought, right, in some breathwork practices that unless what you're describing is something called tetany, right? And it's very physiological in nature. You breathe out too much carbon dioxide, you change the pH of your blood, you bind calcium, your muscles contract. Right. But there's this idea of like, if you don't go into tetany, you didn't go hard enough. You know, and it's like, like you said, it's like forcing you to breathe through your mouth at gunpoint. You know, like when we set up these like group containers and we get everyone to go kind of hard and fast, and there is this natural kind of, not peer pressure, but we kind of follow the group a little bit. Everyone's physiology is different. You're obviously a little bit more sensitive to changes in your carbon dioxide levels. And so a lot of people go into this and it's super uncomfortable for some people, can be quite painful, and they don't know what's going on. No one explained that, hey, it's just because you've been hyperventilating for a while, go back to normal breathing, it's going to go away. The first time I experienced it and I had no understanding of what it was, right? My fingers went into this locked position and in my head, I'm like, I can't be a physio anymore. I broke my fingers are stuck.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I thought I was having a
freaking
stroke.
out.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like, oh, chill, I'm having those. I was like, what did I do? Like, I got to change my career. Like, I got these like claw fingers now. You know, it's like no expectation was set. So I didn't know what the hell was going on. And all it would be required for me to not have had that bad experience is someone took 10 seconds to be like, if you do this may happen. This is why it's happening. This is how you get out of it.
We never got that.
They explain the emotional side of it. Like, you might cry. And I think a couple of people did get pretty emotional.
No one said anything physical.
But they didn't say anything physical.
Yeah.
I was like, I didn't get there. I was like getting really, really lightheaded. And I like just hypochondriac started freaking out. And then so I dialed it back. I just didn't know where to go.
Yeah.
But the big thing for me was because like we were out in the sun. I had people around me. I couldn't like stay in the moment. I kept getting really distracted. I'm like, oh, what's this person doing? What's this sun? What's this piece of sand? Like I just couldn't. So that was the other thing I was going to say. Like, is it likened almost to meditation? Like being able to be in the moment and stay with it?
Yeah, you know, I like to call breathwork like an active meditation. You know, you can do all the right things. Like I tell you, hey, breathe this fast, breathe this deep, you know, like do the right stuff. If you're thinking about what's for dinner later, like you're probably not going to have this transformative experience, right? Like you have to have, I like to, it's funny, right? The acronym of AIR, like attention, intention, and relaxation is a really important one, right? Like if I'm breathing hard and fast and I'm tense and my jaw's clenched, like what's my nervous system perceiving? You know, again, it's probably thinking like something threatening is happening. I'm not going to have this like blissed out transcendent experience because like what's going on? So if I can do the right things, right, in terms of the breathing pattern, but I can keep my attention, right, my intention, and I continue to relax. I think that's often the gateway for people to like move out of that like state that you're describing and into this really like present moment, like what's happening in my body.
I guess like if you are focusing on like whatever breathwork structure you have to be doing, that kind of is where your attention is, because you're trying to focus on doing it properly, and it can kind of take away, you know, like when you're driving, you know, you focus on the road and then you kind of go on autopilot a little bit. So like once you're focused on that breath work, you kind of free up your mind and give it the ability to go where it needs to go.
And but it also is, you know, sometimes you get into a rhythm and then your brain is like, cool, that's on track. Like let me go and solve all these problems. You know, like let me go and think of all this shit. Like what did I say in year 10? Like, you know, so being able to be like, oh wait, I don't have my attention, right? It's elsewhere. And so bringing it back to the breathing. And it's a really interesting thing because if you combine those things, I don't like to use the word the right way, but in a intentional way, that's again where I think it's like my mind is drifting off. Can I pull it back? There's meditation, right? Like what is meditation if not that kind of catching my mind wandering and bringing it back? So I can do that whilst I'm kind of shifting my physiology. That's where I think it changes from meditation. You know, meditation is very focused on kind of the awareness and the passivity of my breath. But if I'm breathing a certain way, right, it's going to push my nervous system, my physiology, my energy, my emotions. But again, if my mind veers off, I think I get a different experience. And it's not, you know, coming back to the point you made earlier, right? It's like, is every practice perfect? No. You know, it's like, and I talk a lot to my clients about this, but like sometimes I'm going to sit down for a 10-minute breathwork practice and it's 9 minutes of torture. You know, it's like fighting my mind and thinking all these things, and like the last 30 seconds I'm like, oh, that felt good. You know, and other days like 30 seconds in I'm there and I'm like, I just have 10 minutes of feeling really, really good. Every day's different. You know, it's like, so the expectation of I'm going to sit down, I'm going to feel blissed out and breathwork's amazing is unrealistic. You know?
So on those days where you've gone through those 9 minutes of torture, is it one of those things when we talk about balance again where you push through because you know at 9 minutes 30 you may achieve bliss, or it's like, this isn't working with me today, I'm going to pack up and try again tomorrow? You know,
this kind of push or pivot kind of thing, right? Like I've found, and this will be different for everyone, but I find that I usually pivot before pushing. And so I've learned for myself, it's like, okay, if I can set a timer and I'm just going to do this for 10 minutes, but I remove the expectation that it's going to go a certain way, you know, that allows me just to like, oh, I'm just going to do this for 10 minutes. And it might be 10 minutes and it sucked, right? But my goal was to do it for 10 minutes versus my goal was to feel great. And so that removal, and I used to have that expectation. I'd get down and I'd do breath work and I'd come out and be like, didn't work. You know, it's like, of course it worked. You know, it's just like, it maybe didn't give me the idea that I had in my mind or where I was going to get to. But for me, the benefit coming back to consistency is like, I'm just going to sit down and do 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It may not, solve all my problems, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Could you walk us through an exercise? I don't know if it works, of like a general exercise to set us up with a good morning, I suppose, mindfulness. Is there something that all of us could do in, say, like 10 minutes before we start our day?
Yeah. Read a page, write a page. And I don't mean a book, right? Like I was actually just writing on this today. When we wake up and I grab my phone or I think about my day, it's like immediately my nervous system is kind of hijacked. So the read a page kind of is like, just observe where you're starting from, right? So the first thing you do when you wake up, right, is if you just like lay in bed, don't do anything, just observe. Like my breath being a reflection of my nervous system, I want to read a page from my nervous system. Where am I starting from today? Like, am I starting anxious? Am I starting tired? Am I fatigued, right? There's no judgment. There's no right or wrong. It's just like, I'm just going to take 1 minute to observe, and the more you do this, the more information you'll get from your breathing and from your body, right? Like the first time anyone does this, you wake up and do it tomorrow, and you'll be like sitting here observing, and I'm like, what am I noticing? There's not a lot going on. The more you do it, you're like, feels a bit tight, feels a bit slow. It's like you get more from it the more you do it. The idea is like, where am I starting from? The writer page is, where do I want to be? And so if I wake up and I observe and I'm like, I'm feeling a little hopped up, my writer page is like, let me bring myself down. Like, let me create the set point that I'm going to return to throughout the day. We have that set point, and then we're going to go up and down from there. And so I get this ability to kind of give myself a bigger buffer zone, right? That writer page, and it's not always, bring myself down. If it's like, I might observe and I'm like, I'm feeling super lethargic. I don't want to get out of bed today. I might need to lift my energy up, right? So I'm going to breathe differently. So that writer page is just an attempt to kind of like take me to the point that I think would be a better set point for me today. I can come back to that throughout the day. It's like, open up my work inbox and there's an email that kind of like, I can observe. Oh, here I am like responding to that thing, and maybe I haven't even opened the email, but it's from someone. I think it's going to be something, and I'm setting up this story in my head. It's like, oh, let me observe that happening. How do I want my nervous system to respond, right? Like, let me take 1 minute and breathe my way back down to that set point. And so, but the starting of the day, instead of us getting kind of hijacked, it's like, let me kind of slowly ramp my nervous system up into a wakeful state. I can do the exact same thing at the end of the day, right? I can lay in my bed before I go to sleep and I can observe, like, how's my nervous system after today? Today was a chaos, right? And I'm feeling that. I'm a bit tired, I'm a bit wired, like, write a page. How do I want my nervous system to be just before I go to sleep? So I might slow my breath down and navigate towards that more restful state. And so that kind of like, rather than say, hey, go and do this practice, right? It's like, what do you need? But to give people something that is a bit more actionable, right? If I observe and I notice my nervous system is running a little bit hot and I need to calm down, we kind of want to extend the exhale rather than the inhale. So let's say I'm breathing in for 4 seconds, I may be breathing out for 6 or 7 seconds. That longer exhale is going to tend to calm you down, right?
Okay.
It's stimulating that parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. If vice versa, I'm like, I'm feeling super flat, I just don't even want to get out of bed, but I got shit to do. If I extend or enhance the inhale, right? So maybe I breathe in for 4 or 5 seconds and I only exhale for 2 or 3, that prioritizing or emphasizing the inhale is going to have a sympathetic effect, right? Okay. So it's going to kind of wake me up.
Okay.
And so if I just take that first thing of observe, right? Read a page from my nervous system, where am I at? And then where do I want to be? Do I need to go up? Do I need to go down? I can either emphasize or lengthen the inhale or the exhale. And that can be a 2-3 minute practice, But again, if it's the first thing you do, you get a little bit more awareness of how your day's going to go. It's like, oh, I'm starting kind of anxious today, right? If I don't do anything and then I go and smack a coffee and I skip breakfast and I jump into my inbox and it's like, oh, why am I feeling really jittery and apprehensive today? It's like, well, you started at an 8 and now you're like touching a 10. Whereas you could have just taken 5 minutes and brought yourself down to a 4 or a 5 and then allowed yourself that buffer zone.
Yeah. Obviously, we'll just shot questions at you. Obviously, different areas of personal interest and things like that. Is there anything that you feel like would be really good to educate someone that hasn't really like informed about breathwork or wants to know more about breathwork? Yeah,
I would say coming back to awareness, rather than, a lot of people's perception of breathwork is what I would call experiential breathwork. It's a bunch of people laying in a room, hyperventilating, crying, having this experience. Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily need to be, nor should it be where you start. So don't kind of allow what breathwork seems to be to kind of flavor whether or not you're going to go engage in it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, you know, when I say breathwork, they're like, oh, I don't really want to cry in front of everyone.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's not what I'm talking about, you know, like, but that's probably what you've seen on Instagram.
Yeah.
And so regardless of what it is that you've seen, you know, what you think breathwork might be, just to remove all of that, you know, and just think of like, I'm breathing, you know, is understanding the thing that drives my body beneficial to me. Like, and I've never met anyone that says no to that.
Yeah.
It's like, if I just gave you a car, but you didn't know how to drive, like how useful is the car?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I don't know, like how it works. Or, you know, you've driven an automatic car for your whole life and I put you in a manual and I don't teach you how to drive a manual car. You're going to stall. You don't know where the handbrake is. Like you can't drive that car. There's nothing wrong with the car. You just don't know how to drive it.
Yeah.
I would argue people are often the same way with their body, right? Like we're not taught this in childhood. We're not taught it in school. We're not taught it in a professional sense, right? Yeah. So you have to take the personal responsibility of like, I need to work out how to use my own breath, right, as a tool that helps me live a better life.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's where it should kind of start and almost stop, right? It doesn't have to be some grand goal or I'm using breath. It's like, I should probably understand the thing that keeps me alive.
Yeah.
You know, like if it is kind of that simple and if people kind of, you know, that doesn't land, it's just like, well, stop doing it for a while and see what happens.
Yeah.
You know?
So interesting because like I was seeing like a psychologist for like anxiety and panic attacks and things like that, and he explained the whole chemical response, the biological response, like the adrenaline versus noradrenaline, breaking the cycle, and like that fight or flight response. But he missed out that one thing that obviously you've explained now is how to like do the breath work to stop that cycle. And it feels like now looking at it retrospectively, I'm like, that's such a like simple element, but he like attacked it from such a high level and just didn't even start with like, okay, well, when you're hyperventilating, slow your breath down, do this breath work. And it's just like, you know, that's someone you're paying, again, like we said at the start, like $200-$300 for an hour, and it's giving you this really high level piece of information, but hasn't like translated it into something simple and actionable that you can actually use. So what do you think is going to be like the point where like the GPs and the psychologists and things like that are actually working together to actually like utilize that piece?
Yeah, I think we're hopefully, you know, it's the optimist in me that we're on the way there.
Yeah.
You know, I hope like the work that we do with our certification is to try and get this out into the hands of health professionals, you know, so that someone goes to the school counselor and instead of then being sent to the psychiatrist, they assess their physiology. It's like, you're breathing 30 times a minute. You should feel anxious. There's nothing wrong with you, right? That's the correct response from your nervous system, but we're not assessing that. It's like, you feel anxious all the time? Here's some medication. You know, like ADHD is a really interesting one. And I posted about this the other day and people just like threw stones very quickly.
Yeah.
You know, but there's so much research to show this overlap between like chronic mouth breathing and symptoms of ADHD and then sleep disruption and symptoms of ADHD. But people get their hackles up and they're just like, you're saying that breathing causes ADHD? I'm like, no. But if you take a child that has symptoms of ADHD and you take them to a psychiatrist, they're going to be put on Ritalin, which is oftentimes a lifelong prescription. And maybe their problem was they were breathing poorly, right? We've given them the wrong treatment, right? Because they've had a misdiagnosis. And so like, let's open up that conversation and let's get this information of like a physiological assessment should be the first thing we do for anyone. Whether it's a child that can't concentrate at school, whether it's someone that's feeling anxious, like we should look at the thing that creates that state, which is physiology. You know, it's like your body, like the anxiety is not coming from outside in, you know, it's coming from inside out. The trigger might be something outside, you know, something someone said or a social situation, but the experience of anxiety is happening inside your body. So we should assess your body, you know? And so like a big part of the work that I'm doing now is like, how do we get that being the first thing that we do, you know, whether it's the school counselor, whether it's the doctor, whether it's the physio that, you know, the patient says, oh, I'm in pain, but I'm also really anxious, right? Let's look at your breathing, you know, because oftentimes there's again, I'm not going to just be like, it's the solution all the time, but
it's a great starting point.
It's a great starting point. And let's exhaust that before we go down the prescription route. You know, it's like the prescription's not going anywhere. We can try we should exhaust all our options before we go to that has a very difficult on-ramp. You know, when we look at things like benzodiazepines and anxiety medication, like it's hard to get off those things because we haven't addressed the root cause. You know, the analogy I use with people, it's like if there's a smoke alarm going off in your house, you should probably look for a fire rather than rip the smoke alarm out, right? Like anxiety suppressing medication is ripping the smoke alarm out. It's like, I don't want to hear the alarm anymore. so I'm just going to blanket it instead of like, where's the fire? Right? Like we should look for the fire and we should see if we can put it out rather than just like turning off the alarm.
Do you think it's because it's perceived to be harder to go through the effort of like learning breath work, or like even say going to the gym or anything like that, or actually doing exercises?
I don't think it's an option.
You know?
I just don't even think people
it's
know
not.
it's an option.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't think it is, right? Like
Yeah.
I think if 4 of us went into separate GPs today and said, I'm feeling anxious, I don't think, you know, and again, maybe it's the pessimist in me, I don't think any of them are going to be like, oh, we should look at your breathing.
Yeah,
true.
They're going to be like, how long's it been an issue? And they're going to write a script, you know, or they're going to refer you to a psychologist.
Yeah.
It's like a societal issue.
Yeah. I think it is that bigger picture that I think we're at this point now, we're just so disconnected from our body. We don't trust our body. We're disempowered. And part of that is the medical system is very disempowering. It's like I, as the person of authority, tell you what you need to do instead of like educating you as to how your body works and maybe the decisions that you want to change rather than I said so. You know, like I really try and be cognizant of this when I work with clients. It's not I'm telling you what to do. It's like I'm giving you the options. You got to make the decision, right? Like, but here's why doing this is going to give you a different outcome to doing this. Right? It's not because I said so, because again, that takes away the sense of empowerment that someone feels. If they make the decision of like, you know what, you've laid the cards out and that seems like a better option for me, I'm going to pursue this, then it's them driving that, right? Like I think we should be the captain or the pilot of our own health journeys versus just handing that over to the guy in the white lab coat said, take this pill. So I think it is harder, but we look where that's gotten us today. You know, like we've seen rates of prescriptions for anxiety, depression skyrocket, and we haven't seen the anxiety and depression go down. If the medication worked, we should see, you know, an inverse relationship between how much we prescribe and the prevalence of this. We don't. They accelerate each other. Like it's not the right solution.
Surely there's not some commercial element to this. Like, surely not. Surely there's no
struck down
conflict of interest here.
Spotify does people waiting outside the right now.
This has been so insightful, and it's so nuanced. This concept of breathing. Is there, whilst you mentioned there's not a specific right way to breathe, is there anything objectively wrong of breathing techniques? Like, is nose breathing correct? Is mouth breathing incorrect? Is diaphragmatic breathing what we should be doing 24/7? Is there anything objectively wrong that people should stop doing?
Such a good question. You know, when anyone asks me like, what's the right way to breathe? I always answer that with like, well, what's the context? You know, like right breathing is adaptable. Like we could just leave it at that. You know, the right or the correct breathing when I'm sitting on a couch should be very different to when I'm lifting weight if I'm sprinting up a hill. You know, so if we say correct breathing is nasal, diaphragmatic, and slow, try and do that running into a burning building. It's not correct. You should be breathing through your mouth hard and fast. You know, so like correct breathing depends on context. That being said, you know, there are some kind of like overarching rules that we can kind of like, you know, give to people that nasal breathing is better than mouth breathing. Unless you are short duration, high intensity, like I'm sprinting, you know, the last 100 meters of a 5K race, like mouth breathing is going to probably get you there faster. You know, I'm doing little intervals. You know, I can move more air with my mouth, but it doesn't have the same beneficial impact that nasal breathing does, right? Like our nose is a filtration system. We release this gas called nitric oxide, which dilates my blood vessels and relaxes my airways. You know, it's like, it's antibacterial, it's antifungal, it's antiviral. Like that doesn't happen when I breathe through the mouth. You know, so yes, nasal breathing is better than mouth breathing, unless, you know, you're doing something that requires mouth breathing.
Okay.
Try and laugh through your nose, you know? Or don't, but, you know, so it's like we can throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, mouth breathing's bad.
Yeah.
That to me shows that we're not really understanding, you know, breathing as a behavior, as a habit, as a, you know, something that we can control. So like if I intentionally mouth breathe, it can actually be a performance enhancement, right? But if I'm mouth breathing unintentionally or chronically, it literally just like destroys everything. You know, like your brain doesn't work, your heart doesn't work as well, you don't deliver oxygen as well, you don't produce as much energy. Like there's a list of things that happen when you breathe through your mouth. But to then say like it's always bad, I think misses the point. And so nasal over mouth kind of tick 99% of the time. The second one I always point to is like, am I breathing up into my chest kind of vertically, or am I breathing down low and horizontally? Again, like that's going to pull the air into the upper lobes of my lung. It's a shorter course, right? So it's going to get there faster. But that's how you breathe when you've sprinted up a hill or you're running away from someone. You know, if I'm doing that while I'm sitting on the couch, it's a problem because it's telling my nervous system something about the environment, right? And so as a whole, breathing low in my body is better than breathing high in my body, right? Except for when it's intentional. And then the kind of final one is fast and slow. You know, is fast breathing beneficial for some things? Absolutely. Do breath work, run, right? Any exercise that's creating a demand in your body. But if I'm at rest and it's like the higher my respiratory rate, the higher my heart rate, the higher my blood pressure, the more active my brain in terms of brainwave states. So the vice versa is also true. When I'm breathing slower, my blood pressure drops, my heart rate drops, my brainwaves slow down, I feel calmer. And so we can kind of point to that as like, what I tend to point to people is like low, slow through the nose, right? Breathe low in your body, breathe slowly and use your nose for 99% of the time. But don't be afraid of opening your mouth or breathing into your chest or breathing quickly when you decide to do it.
Can I please confirm that when you're just walking around normally throughout your day, you're breathing through your mouth?
Nose.
All the time, you're just breathing through your nose?
Yes.
Fuck.
You're a mouth breather.
Yeah.
I was a mouth breather for 27 years, you know, like this kind of, I noticed these things in terms of I would wake up in the morning and I would like have a split lip, my mouth would be dry and I'd feel like shit. You know, I'm like, oh, I'm just a slow riser. It takes me a while to get going. Yeah. When I started, you know, prioritizing and developing my ability to nasal breathe all day and at night with a little bit of mouth tape, I woke up feeling absolutely different. You know, but I didn't realize that there was a difference in how I could feel, right? It's just how I'd felt. It's always how I feel. Like that was my bandwidth, you know, that's like how I'm navigating the world. And then I started making these changes. I'm like, oh, I got way more energy. Like where was this, you know, before? I'm way less, all these things change because of this one like behavioral change. Yeah. And so like, unless you're talking, eating, expressing yourself emotionally or exercising intensely, your mouth should be closed. Right, like nose is for breathing, mouth is for eating and communicating.
Okay, so going on a 5K run, we're mouth breathing?
Nose breathing.
Nose breathing still running?
Yes, right? And this is like, if you all go for a 5K run tomorrow and you try and keep your mouth closed, you'll be like, that fucking Campbell, you know, it's like, it's going to feel really, really hard. You haven't built the capacity to do it yet, right? Doesn't mean what you're doing is the right way to do it. It's just easier.
Well, your nasal airways like actually open up more the more
right?
you train them.
There's a plasticity element to this. You know, it's like, the longer you mouth breathe, the easier it gets to mouth breathe, the harder it gets to nasal breathe, right? So if you went for a brisk walk after this and you tried to breathe through your nose, you'd be like, oh, it feels like I'm not getting enough air. Actually, what you're feeling is an accumulation of CO2. It's not like a lack of oxygen. It's more CO2 than you're used to. And your brain says, get rid of it. Open your mouth, right? So there's a way that I can train myself to tolerate more CO2, right? That allows me to continue to nasal breathe at higher intensities. You watch the guy that just broke, was it a 2-hour marathon, something crazy? He nasal breathes 90% of that run, right? His paces, like when he's losing pace, he opens his mouth, he shoots a little bit faster, and then he comes back to nasal breathing. You know, so when we actually look at the respiratory physiology side of things, like as soon as you open your mouth, you get rid of more CO2, which means you can't actually move as much oxygen from your blood to your cells. And then you go anaerobic, right? And this is where lactic acid comes from. You're not getting enough oxygen to the mitochondria. They still have to produce energy, so they do it a dirtier way, right? Which has waste, right? Which is lactate and pyruvate and these metabolic wastes. That's like when you hit the wall, right? You've hit this, you've gone into anaerobic and you've started to develop this. Like you more or less don't hit that, you know, I'm not going to say ever, but if you can maintain nasal breathing because you're retaining more CO2, you're not breathing it out as much, it facilitates the movement of oxygen from your blood to your cells. Mitochondria keep producing energy with the presence of oxygen. You don't make that metabolic waste. And so like, again, it's really important. Like you're not just going to be able to run a 5K tomorrow with your mouth closed. You got to train for it. You know, I think this is, this conversation, this is a really interesting point that comes up. If you go for a run and your goal is to run as fast as you can or push yourself as hard as you can, nasal breathing is not going to help you meet that goal. Why is that your goal? You know, like if your goal was health or it was, it's like, so instead of my metric being intensity, it's like I'm going to go hard and my breathing's going to do whatever it has to do for me to go hard. What if my goal or my metric was like I'm going to go as hard as I can whilst I maintain optimal breathing? You might not run the 5K as fast. In fact, you won't to start with, but you'll have a better response from your nervous system. You'll have improved physiology. You'll, like there's all these other benefits that come with that. Did you spike your heart rate and have a really hard workout? No. If that's your only goal, then go for it. Run the 5K with your mouth open, but if your goal is supporting your system, you might find more benefit from running that a little bit slower so that you can nasal breathe.
Are you like things like nose tape and things like that good?
I was just going to ask about the nose strips.
Yeah. Nose strips.
Right, man, I run with my mouth tip.
Yeah.
You know, anything that dilates your airways and gives you more access to movement of air is often going to help, right?
Yeah.
Like people have deviated septums, they got tighter nasal passages.
Or like allergies and like sinuses.
So there's obviously
like
it's not just possible for everyone just to just nasal breathe 100% of the time.
Yeah.
You know, if there is something like, well, I'm always congested, we might look to, are you reacting to a certain food or is it an immune response? Like, why are you always congested? But you know, like I find that when I use like a nasal dilator, there's either the tape ones or there's these little plastic kind of like tubes that you can just hold your nose open, right? If you breathe in really hard, your nose kind of collapses a little bit, right? And so less air is getting in. If something's keeping that propped open, then you're just going to get more air in. So it's a good kind of like stepping stone. It's like I want to start exercising whilst nasal breathing, like it's going to support that. It's not 100% necessary for everyone, but I think use the crutches when you need them.
Yeah.
I just think it's funny that this whole episode you're going to hear like breaths in the background. Like, full of us.
Each time you've said something about breath, I've taken a big deep breath to like relax, and then all of them have been with my mouth.
Right? So this is a really good, you know, like for you to leave from this episode and be like, oh, I'm going to build the awareness around my nasal breathing, right? And like whenever my mouth is open and I notice it, I'm going to close it, right? I'm going to go back to nasal breathing. You'll catch yourself all the time, you know.
It's going to be great. I'm just going to shut my mouth more often. Everyone around is going to love it.
Not good for the podcast. But you know, it's like if I just left you with the goal of like, hey, breathe more through your nose and just notice more often. Like it's a really hard thing to do. So I always give people this kind of like tip of every time you check your phone, check your breathing. You know, we check our phone dozens, if not some people probably like 50, 60, 100 times a day. If you set up this little conditioned response, it's like every time I check my phone, I'm like, oh yeah, there's that reminder, like I check my breathing, nose or mouth, right? If your mouth's open, close it. Chest or belly, if you're breathing up here, breathe down low. Fast or slow, just take a slow breath, right? Like it's going to take you 5 seconds. Then forget about it. Literally forget about it. It's like, it's not now I'm like trying to just hold on to this awareness, like let go till the next time you grab your phone. Nose or mouth, chest or belly, fast or slow. And in doing that, right, like let's say you do that 12 times a day, you literally start to create this like neurological groove, right, which says nasal, low, slow, you know, and that will change the state of your nervous system. It'll change your physiology. It'll change your emotional state. Like there's just untold benefits to that. And it's not really like I've given you an exercise that you need to sit down and do 10 minutes. Like every time I do this thing that I already do a bunch of times, I take this little 5-second check-in and I make this little tiny incremental change. But if I do that, again, you know, done 12 times a day for a week, you know, it's like I'm starting to create the cumulative effect that's going to change my habitual behavior.
So when someone listens to this episode and realizes they're a terrible mouth breather,
dirty mouth breather,
and they want to start taking the first steps to change it, where are we finding you? What's the process to enlist your services?
Yeah, best place is definitely Instagram. I try and share as much value on there as I can. I always just encourage people to send me a message. You know, it's me on my Instagram. And people often want to be like, oh yeah, you mentioned all this stuff, but like, I'm a special snowflake and I don't think breathwork's going to fix it. It's like, it's so often the case that it's like, it's good for all those things, but the thing I'm going through, like definitely won't work. And so I encourage people just like, let's have a conversation and I'll explain to you why and how, like,
why you're not special.
Oh, you're the same as all of us. But I do have a 5-week kind of self-paced course that people can take themselves through that looks at these things, right? Like how do we look at a self-assessment for your diaphragm, your mechanics, your physiology, your nervous system. It's a great place for people to start. Like that's why I built that course, is I can't work with everyone. It's like, here are the common problems that everyone faces, right? You live in today's world, you likely have elements of these dysfunctions because you sit at a desk, you're on your phone, you know, like a few of these different things that are probably going to come out in your breathing, and here's these like general approaches that are going to help and not hurt.
So first step, Instagram, free education on there, Next Works course, and then do you do like one-on-one sessions and things like that as well?
I kind of steered away at the moment, well, not even at the moment, over the last couple of years, like people often hit me up as like, I just want to do a session. And I don't do one-off sessions anymore because it's like, you're going to have more questions than answers. Like I work like with people usually like a minimum of 8 weeks because it shows me they actually want to make change. Right? Like I want to book a session, tells me like, you know, maybe you're not ready to actually put in the work that's necessary. And that's nothing, you know, like people are going to come to this when they're ready to it. But I've just found that, you know, when I used to do a session here and there, you know, people walk away from it. It's like, well, I'm still kind of anxious. I'm like, yeah, we spent 45 minutes together.
Yeah.
You know, you've been anxious for 10 years. Like, this is going to take a little bit of work. So I usually point to people we kind of do a month-long intensive of like, let's really assess and look at everything and put together a plan. And then we kind of like keep you on that plan for a couple of months.
Yeah, and see how you react to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. It's been amazing, man.
Oh,
This has been so
I
good.
can't wait to re-listen to this episode.
Honestly.
With your mouth closed.
Yeah. Duct tape shut.
Yeah, incredible.
Is there
So
anything
good.
else, like any other final bits of advice you want to give to people?
Or anything you want to plug?
Yeah, anything you want to
Anything coming
plug?
up?
The only thing we didn't, I mentioned it a couple of times, but you know, for those of you that aren't individuals looking to optimize breathing and perhaps are practitioners of some variety, you know, whether you're a health coach, a fitness coach, a doctor, a dentist, anyone that works with other people, you know, we do run a practitioner program, so a certification that kind of a lot of the stuff we talked about that today, you know, in terms of safety and understanding the mechanism and being able to assess and treat. Then we run that as well, and that's a cohort we run every month. And so you can find that again on Instagram. But if you are someone that works with other people and you want to understand maybe how integrating breath into what you do, you know, is going to give you some of these outcomes, then reach out to me there.
Mate,
Love
I love
that.
your work.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you
good.
very, very, very
Thank
much
you
for
so much,
coming
Campbell.
and sharing your knowledge with us. All the best with the flight back home. And
Yeah.
Yeah, cheers,
Salute.
guys.
We'll get you back time.
Yeah. Next time I'm
Didn't even
back.
talk about the cold therapy. That's for the next one.
Yeah, round
Part
two.
two. Part two.
Part two, yeah.
Run it back.
Adios.
Thank
Bye.
you, brother.
Thanks,
See ya.
Cheers, man.